I froze in disbelief as the door to my room swung open. My stepmother and her best friend stumbled in, their laughter echoing through the walls. I was standing there, half-dressed, completely vulnerable. But instead of leaving, they closed the door behind them and smiled. What started as an innocent mistake quickly turned into something I never saw coming. Something that would change my life forever. I always thought my family was far from perfect, but I never expected it to unravel like this. My parents divorced when I was just 10, and my life split in two. My mom moved away and quickly remarried, while my dad tried to rebuild his life with Karen, my new stepmother. Karen was nothing like my mom. Where my mother was warm and affectionate, Karen was cold and distant. She treated me more like a responsibility than a family member, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never break through her walls. My dad, however, adored her. He saw her as a strong woman who stepped up to help raise me, but I always felt like an outsider in my own home. Karen's best friend, Jen, was a constant presence in our lives. She was older, loud, and had a laugh that could shake the walls. She treated every visit like a party, and Karen seemed to come alive whenever Jen was around. While my dad found Jen's humor entertaining, I found it exhausting. Her jokes and teasing often made me feel uncomfortable, especially when she drank, which was often. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Karen and Jen were just two women having fun, enjoying their evenings with wine and laughter. But behind their smiles, there was an unspoken tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. That Friday night, the house was louder than usual. Music blared from the living room, and bursts of laughter drifted up the stairs to my room. I tried to focus on my studies, but the noise was impossible to ignore. I knew this wasn't the first time they'd had one of their girls' nights, but something about this one felt different. I finally gave up and decided to go to bed. I pulled out my pajamas, hoping to block out the noise and get some rest. But just as I started changing, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Before I could react, my bedroom door flew open, and there they were, giggling and swaying as they stood in the doorway. I didn't know it then, but that moment would shatter every boundary I thought existed in my home. Karen and Jen stood in the doorway, their eyes scanning the room before settling on me. My heart raced as I fumbled to cover myself, feeling completely exposed. "Oh, we didn't mean to interrupt," Jen said with a laugh that didn't match the apology in her words. Karen smirked, leaning against the doorframe as if she owned the space. I expected them to leave, but they didn't. Instead, they stepped inside and closed the door behind them. "What are you doing up here all alone?" Jen asked, her tone playful but layered with something else, something unsettling. I forced a polite smile and tried to keep my voice steady. "I was just getting ready for bed." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Bed? It's still early. You're young. Don't you know this is when the fun starts?" Her words hung in the air, and Jen chuckled as if they were sharing an inside joke. I couldn't understand why they were acting this way. Sure, they were drunk. Clearly too much wine had been poured downstairs, but this wasn't normal. Their eyes lingered too long, their smiles too wide. It was like they saw me differently, as if something had shifted between us. I stepped back, keeping my distance as Jen plopped onto my bed and patted the space next to her. "Come on, sit down. We won't bite." My skin crawled at her words. "I'm really tired," I said, trying to end the conversation without causing a scene. Karen laughed and crossed her arms. "Relax. We just want to talk. You're acting like we're strangers." That's exactly what they felt like, strangers. I didn't recognize this version of my stepmother. Her usual stern demeanor had melted away, replaced by something looser, something I couldn't trust. Jen leaned back on her elbows, her eyes fixed on me. "You've really grown up, haven't you?" she said, her voice dripping with something that made my stomach turn. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed my phone, pretending to check messages. I hoped they'd take the hint, but Karen only stepped closer. "You're so tense," she said, resting a hand on my shoulder. I froze at her touch, unexpected and far too familiar. "You need to lighten up a little." Jen grinned. "Yeah, maybe you just need to let loose." Their words felt like daggers, sharp and deliberate. I couldn't tell if they were joking or testing me, but the tension in the room grew heavier with every passing second. I cleared my throat and stepped away. "I really think you should go," I said, firmer this time. Karen and Jen exchanged glances, their smiles faltering for just a moment before Karen shrugged. Fine. We'll leave." But as Jen stood up, she leaned in closer than necessary, her breath warm against my neck. "You're missing out," she whispered, and then she laughed as if it was nothing. When they finally left, closing the door behind them, I felt like I could breathe again. But the damage was done. My heart pounded in my chest as I locked the door and sat down on the edge of my bed. What just happened? Were they really just drunk and teasing, or was there something more to it? I tried to push the thoughts away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this night wasn't over. I didn't know what Karen and Jen were capable of, but one thing was clear. The boundaries of this house had just been crossed, and I didn't know if they could ever be repaired. I sat on my bed, my heart still racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The room felt smaller, heavier, as if their presence had left a lingering weight in the air. I kept telling myself that they were just drunk, that their words and actions didn't mean anything. But the way Karen looked at me, the way Jen leaned in so close, left me questioning everything. Minutes passed, but I couldn't relax. I decided to step out and get some water, hoping to clear my mind. As I opened my bedroom door, I heard faint whispers and laughter drifting up from the living room. Their voices felt closer than before, and curiosity tugged at me despite my better judgment. I crept halfway down the stairs and stopped when I saw them. Karen was stretched out on the couch, her legs draped over Jen's lap. They were sipping from their wine glasses, their cheeks flushed and eyes heavy-lidded. But it wasn't just the alcohol that made me uneasy. It was the way they were looking at each other, like two teenagers sharing secrets. Then Karen said something that sent a chill through me. "Do you think he even knows how much attention he gets?" Jen laughed, setting her glass down. "Oh, he knows. Boys always know when someone's looking at them." I froze, gripping the railing tighter. Were they talking about me? I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding, but then Jen's voice dropped lower, almost a purr. "He's definitely noticed you." Karen smirked. "Noticed me? You think so?" Jen leaned in closer. "Oh, I saw the way he looked at you earlier, nervous, flustered. He's curious, Karen. Trust me." My breath hitched. I felt my stomach twist as their words played over in my mind. Was this some twisted joke? Were they testing me or testing each other? I should have gone back to my room, but instead, I stayed frozen on the stairs, unable to look away. Karen took another sip of her wine and set the glass down before standing up. She smoothed her dress, her movements slow and deliberate, then turned toward the stairs. I bolted back into my room, closing the door softly but firmly. My heart pounded as I leaned against it, listening for footsteps. Seconds later, I heard them, slow, measured steps coming closer. The doorknob rattled, and then Karen's voice broke the silence. "Are you still awake?" I didn't answer. Another knock. "Come on, open up. We just want to talk." Panic surged through me. "I'm tired, Karen. I'll talk to you tomorrow." A pause. Then Jen's voice joined in. "Don't be like that. We're just having fun. You don't have to hide from us." I stayed silent, hoping they'd give up. Finally, after what felt like forever, I heard them walk away. But even as their footsteps faded, I knew this wasn't over. Sleep didn't come easily that night. My thoughts raced, bouncing between anger, confusion, and something else, something I didn't want to admit. Part of me felt disgusted by their behavior, but another part couldn't ignore the way Karen's eyes lingered on me or the way Jen's voice seemed to echo in my ears. The next morning, I hoped things would go back to normal, but the tension only grew. Karen acted like nothing had happened, smiling and chatting casually over breakfast, while Jen gave me a sly grin that sent shivers down my spine. Throughout the day, their presence felt heavier, their glances bolder. Karen brushed past me in the kitchen, her hand lingering on my arm for just a second too long. Jen found reasons to ask me questions, her eyes locked on mine as if daring me to react. I tried to act normal, but I felt like prey being circled by predators. And the worst part, a tiny voice in the back of my head whispered that part of me liked the attention, that part of me wanted more. By the time evening came, I couldn't take it anymore. I locked myself in my room, but it didn't feel like enough. The walls seemed thinner, the air heavier. And then came the knock, soft at first, then firmer. "Open up," Karen said. I ignored it. "Don't make us wait," Jen added, her voice teasing but laced with something darker. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I reached for the lock. My mind screamed at me to stop, to keep them out, but my body moved on its own. The door creaked open, and there they stood, smiling, waiting. And in that moment, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The door creaked open, and there they stood, Karen and Jen, smiling as though they had planned this moment all along. My chest tightened as Karen stepped inside first, her eyes scanning the room before settling on me. Jen followed, closing the door behind her with a soft click that made the walls feel like they were closing in. What's with the look? Karen teased, her lips curling into a smirk. You act like we're about to eat you alive. Jen laughed, her voice low and rich. Unless you want us to. My throat went dry. I wanted to shout, to demand they leave, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped back, bumping into my desk, feeling cornered. This isn't funny, I finally managed to say. Jen raised an eyebrow. Who said we were joking? Karen took another step closer. You've grown up so much, she said, her voice softer now, almost admiring. You're not a boy anymore, are you? Her words hung in the air like a trap, and I couldn't look away. My mind screamed at me to push past them, to end this, but my body refused to move. Jen circled around to my side, leaning close enough that I could smell the wine on her breath. Relax, she whispered. You're too tense. We're just here to have fun. My pulse raced as Karen reached out and brushed her fingers against my arm. The touch was light, almost casual, but it sent a jolt through me. You trust us, don't you? She asked, her eyes locking with mine. No. I don't know, I stammered. Jen laughed again, this time closer, and I felt her fingers trace lightly down my back. You don't know, she echoed, her voice dripping with amusement. I think you do. Karen leaned in, her lips so close to my ear that I could feel her breath. We're not here to hurt you, she whispered. We just noticed how much you've changed. And maybe it's time you noticed, too. Her words shattered what little composure I had left. I shoved past them, my voice rising. Enough. This is wrong. Whatever this is, it needs to stop. For a moment, they both stared at me, their smiles faltering. I thought I'd finally gotten through to them, but then Jen stepped forward again, her expression hardening. Wrong, she said, her tone sharp. Who decides what's wrong and what's not? You're not a kid anymore, you're a man. Or maybe you're still scared to admit it. Karen's eyes softened, as if she were trying to defuse the situation. We didn't mean to scare you, she said gently, but her words felt rehearsed. We just wanted to help you. Loosen up a little. I shook my head. This isn't normal. You barged into my room. This isn't okay. Jen crossed her arms, her expression turning defensive. You're overreacting. Karen's face fell, and for the first time, she looked genuinely unsure. We didn't mean to push too far, she said quietly. We'll leave. Jen hesitated, but Karen pulled her toward the door. As they stepped out, Jen shot me one last look, a mix of amusement and something darker, before the door shut behind them. I collapsed onto my bed, my body trembling. What had just happened? Had they really tried to cross a line, or was I imagining it? My thoughts spiraled, but no matter how I turned it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The next morning, Karen acted as if nothing had happened. She smiled over breakfast, asked about my plans for the day, and laughed at my dad's jokes as if the night before had been wiped from her memory. Jen, however, wasn't there. I hoped that meant she wouldn't be coming back, but deep down I knew better. Later that afternoon, Karen pulled me aside while my dad was in the garage. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice low and serious. I crossed my arms. About last night. She nodded, her eyes filled with something that looked like guilt, or was it fear? I think we had too much to drink, and things got confusing. I waited, but she didn't say more. That's it? I asked. Confusing? She took a step closer, lowering her voice. I just don't want you to think badly of me, or of Jen. We weren't trying to hurt you. I wanted to believe her, but her words felt hollow. Then maybe you should talk to Jen because she didn't seem confused at all. Karen flinched. I'll handle Jen. I promise. But as she turned to leave, I noticed something, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, as if she wasn't sure whether she meant what she said. The days that followed were tense. Karen avoided me, and Jen stopped coming around, but the damage had already been done. Every glance, every touch, every word from that night replayed in my mind like a broken record. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to tell my dad. When I finally sat him down and told him what happened, his face turned pale. At first, he didn't believe me. He tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but as I described their words and actions, his expression darkened. This can't continue, he said, his voice shaking. I'll take care of it. And just like that, the fragile walls of my home began to crumble. The silence that followed my confession to my dad felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. He sat there, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Are you absolutely sure about this? He finally asked, his voice low and strained. I nodded, my chest tightening. I wouldn't make something like this up. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if trying to process the words. Then, he stood up and walked out of the room without another word. I heard him head toward the living room where Karen was folding laundry, humming softly to herself. I followed slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Karen," he said sharply. She looked up, startled by the tone of his voice. "What's wrong? We need to talk, now." Karen glanced at me and then back at him. Her face paled as if she already knew what this was about. She dropped the clothes and stood up. "Can we talk privately?" "No," my dad snapped. "He deserves to hear this." Karen's eyes darted to mine, her lips parting as if she was about to speak, but then she looked back at my dad. "What exactly has he told you?" "He told me what you and Jen did," my dad said, his voice trembling with anger. "The way you cornered him, the things you said." Karen's expression shifted from fear to defiance. "That's not what happened," she snapped. "We were drunk. It was just harmless teasing. He's blowing this way out of proportion." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Harmless teasing?" I cut in. "You locked the door and wouldn't leave. You touched me, Karen. Both of you." Her face flushed red, but whether it was from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. "You're twisting things." "I would never." My dad held up a hand to silence her. "Stop," he said. "You don't get to explain this away." Karen's defenses crumbled, and tears welled up in her eyes. "It was a mistake," she said softly. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. But the damage had already been done." Jen never came back to the house after that night. Karen swore she would never speak to her again, but it didn't change the fact that the boundaries of trust had been shattered. Over the next few days, my dad barely spoke to Karen. The house felt cold and empty, like we were all walking on eggshells. Karen tried to act normal, but I could feel the tension in every interaction. Then, one evening, I came home to find Karen packing her things. "I think it's best if I stay somewhere else for a while," she said, not meeting my eyes. I didn't know how to feel, relieved, angry, guilty. All I knew was that I didn't try to stop her. When my dad came home and saw the bags, he didn't argue. "Maybe it's for the best," he said quietly. The days that followed were strange. Karen's absence should have made me feel safer, but instead, it left a void that was hard to explain. I kept replaying the events of that night, questioning whether I had overreacted. Was Karen really a predator, or had it just been a drunken mistake? My dad tried to be supportive, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He loved Karen, and losing her broke something in him. He never said it out loud, but I could feel his resentment toward me, even if he didn't mean to show it. One night, as we sat at the dinner table in near silence, he finally spoke. "I know you did the right thing by telling me," he said, staring down at his plate. "But I can't help feeling like I failed both of you." I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that Karen had made her own choices, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just said, "I'm sorry." But sorry wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. Karen eventually moved out for good. My dad filed for divorce a few months later, but the scars she left behind didn't fade so easily. For weeks, I kept expecting to hear her voice in the house or to see her standing in the kitchen, smiling like nothing had ever happened. I struggled with guilt, wondering if I could have done something differently, if maybe I'd misread the situation or overreacted. But deep down, I knew the truth. No matter how much I wanted to convince myself otherwise, what she and Jen did wasn't okay. And even though my dad tried to move on, I could see the way it weighed on him. He didn't trust people the way he used to, and neither did I. The weeks after Karen left felt like I was living in the aftermath of a storm. Quiet, but heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. My dad tried to act like he was holding it together, but I could see the cracks in him. He buried himself in work, avoiding long conversations and leaving the house early in the mornings. I couldn't blame him. It wasn't just my world that had fallen apart, his marriage had too. And even though he never said it out loud, I knew he struggled with guilt, wondering if he could have seen the signs earlier or done something to prevent it. I struggled too. The memory of that night haunted me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. Sometimes I'd be brushing my teeth or walking past Karen's old room, and it would hit me all over again, the shock, the confusion, and the shame. But more than anything, I felt angry. Angry at Karen for crossing boundaries she never should have, angry at Jen for encouraging it, and angry at myself for ever doubting what I knew was wrong. At first, I tried to push it all down, pretending it didn't bother me. But the more I bottled it up, the worse it got. I started avoiding people, skipping out on plans with friends, and spending more and more time alone in my room. One night, my dad knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" I hesitated before opening it, but when I saw the look in his eyes, tired but sincere, I let him in. "I know this has been hard on you," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed. It's been hard on me too. But we can't let what happened define us. I didn't say anything, but I listened. I spent too long ignoring the warning signs, he admitted. I thought Karen was the answer to rebuilding our family, but I didn't see what was right in front of me. And for that, I'm sorry. His words caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on my own pain that I hadn't thought about what he'd been going through. It's not your fault, I finally said. None of this is. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. We have to move forward, he continued. And the only way to do that is by learning from this. I thought about what he said long after he left my room. Moving forward seemed impossible at first, but as the days passed, I started to believe it might be possible. I began opening up, to my dad, to a couple of close friends, even to a counselor my dad insisted I see. Talking about it didn't make the memories go away, but it made them easier to handle. I also realized that what happened to me wasn't just about what Karen and Jen did. It was about trust that had been broken and needed time to heal. In the months that followed, I learned how to set boundaries, how to say no without guilt, and how to recognize red flags before they turned into something worse. Karen's absence stopped feeling like a loss and started feeling like freedom. And while I still wrestled with the memories of that night, I no longer let them control me. As for my dad, he changed too. He became more present, more protective, and more aware of the people he let into our lives. We both grew stronger, not because we forgot what happened, but because we faced it. The experience taught me something I'll never forget, that boundaries exist for a reason, and the people who truly care about you will never try to cross them. And no matter how broken you feel, you can always rebuild. It just takes time, trust, and the courage to keep moving forward. What would you do if you were in my position? How would you handle such a shocking betrayal of trust? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm curious to hear your take. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about relationships. Trust me, what's coming next will shock you even more.